what we're going to do just for a few minutes is, I think it is relevant to maybe discuss some of the things that are happening in the church world. Talk about how do we make sure we're not the statistic? How do we move beyond some of these things in our lives? How do we ensure that this doesn't happen to any of us? So really, there's 4 things, but we're going to talk about a lot more, and then we might allow some time for some questions and stuff as well. But really just 4 things. Like entitlement is a big thing that's creeping in so easily. Contempt, just disregard for the work of God and the work that God has called us to. The seduction of money, sex, and power. And then this whole idea of fathering and accountability. Like, does that even exist anymore? And how do we become better at those things in our lives?
There's going to be a WhatsApp number on the screen. If any of you would like to start thinking as we talk, and while we're talking, if any of you would like to start thinking of a question, you can either do it later on via the roving mic, or you could WhatsApp the number, and it'll come through to the phone that we've got here now as well. So, cool.
Sorry, can I just acknowledge before we go any further? I feel like we're almost like in a holy moment.
Yeah.
And I feel like this has been a fathering message. Like seriously.
Brilliant.
Seriously, guys.
Sheesh, I don't even know. Like, it's just, I feel like we almost like need to let some of this stuff sink in.
Yeah.
This is, Sean, this has been a prophetic, fathering message, in my opinion.
Good.
Seriously.
Yeah.
So good luck.
So why don't we just take a few moments and let's just talk through 1 or 2 of these topics. So I'm going to kick off just with this idea of entitlement. How do we disallow the idea of entitlement to creep in? And entitlement happens in so many levels. And this is how I notice it. For example, younger people coming into ministry see all the stories of success and want to get there so fast, and then they see all the jet setters, and they think that is the life of a minister. Yeah. So the quicker I can get there, and so that entitlement starts to creep in. And then I think as you get onto your latter years and you begin to think of retirement, you start to set the church up to make sure that your retirement is successful, and you can easily use some of those things and manipulate some of those things because you feel, well, I've given all my time to ministry and my whole life, and so I deserve this. And it's not that you don't, and it's not that anyone doesn't want to be successful, but how do you ensure that doesn't become kind of the motivating factors in our lives as ministers?
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me? Is that all right?
Yeah.
You know what? I'm a huge fan of providing honor where honor is due, in the sense that we need to honor people up, honor people down, honor all around. We need to really show honor. But the risk of honor is, if we're not careful, we can take that honor to elevate ourselves into positions that are unhealthy, in the sense that when, as leaders, we create an honoring culture, people around us will honor the office that we fulfill, and that, if we're not careful, can become the basis of how we see ourselves. Actually, we become unhealthily obsessed with our own self-importance. Paul Van Coller and myself last night were chatting a little bit, and one of the things he said that was so helpful, again, just to reiterate that, was this idea of we need to recognize what suffering means for the gospel, and recognize that although honor matters, and it does, and when we pave the way for honor and we pave the way for others to fulfill the potential that God's put in them, and we can create credibility, we also need to realize that Jesus suffered, that the apostles suffered, that missionaries for generations have suffered. It's not all about that, and I think if we're not careful, we start to allow the well-meaning, healthy honor that exists to become an unhealthy honor, and it starts with posturing. And I think that's when when we've got to be so careful. One of the things we tell the church, we try so often, and I guess it depends on your wiring too, but we tell our church this a lot, next to myself, it's actually not about us. Please, it's not about us. It's actually, this is not our church. When people come to me and say, well, I loved your church, one of the little habits that we try and put in place, we teach our team this, is to say, no, it's not our church, it's God's church. However, we're part of the family. And repeat those kinds of processes. When people say, oh, that was an amazing message, thank you so much for preaching so well, instead of believing the press, rather to go, gee, well, I'm so grateful that God helped you. And kind of steer away, build away constantly from what happens, because the raw nuts and bolts of that is that if we allow the compliments, the good stuff that people say to become rooted, we start to believe it too. And I think Sean said it so powerfully earlier, is, you know, we all make mistakes, we all get it wrong, we're all on a different journey. So entitlement starts with a posture. And I mean, I think, and we can look at ourselves, you know, one of the things that I think is so important is maybe we can all do this, is have a look at the posts we've posted on social media recently. Just have a look at it. Have a look at the words used, the style of the photograph, the positioning of where we are, what we're actually saying. Not what we hoped we'd say, but when people look at it, what do they say? Because it's all part and parcel of that self-promotion that can become so difficult. And I think, so for me, that's a big thing that I try to put in place, because I think vulnerability, on a vulnerable perspective, my wiring, if you've ever done the Enneagram, I'm an 8 on the Enneagram. I'm a D on the DISC profile. I'm a C, I'm a choleric on the choleric profile. All of those things have horrendous side effects. and part of that is, you know, I run the risk of I personally run the risk of being entitled. So I have to watch that constantly. Sometimes I get it right, a lot of the time I fail, but I work really hard at it.
Sure. Do you want to go first?
Just very practically, I think private acts of generosity and service.
Amen.
I don't think we should always be served. I think we should, and frankly, I think most of it happens at home. So, you know, like, do we actually, like, are we always entitled? Do we always need to be served, or are we able to serve others? So I think private or secret acts of service and sincere generosity, and generosity means different things for different people. So for some people, it's easy to be generous financially. For others, it's harder, and for some, it's easy to be generous at the time. For others, it's harder or interruptible. I don't know. And I think just actually looking at whether, I keep coming back to your message yesterday, are we trying to be great, or can we just be decent? And so I think even just in the context of, am I actually a Christian outside of my leadership role? Am I, the rest of the time,
sure.
Am I actually, am I loving? Am I generous? Am I kind? I think those are, but I think especially stuff that's secret and outside of what receives applause or affirmation, I think that it like starves the soul of I think that unhealthy pride and entitlement. I think.
Shawnee, I think I hear you. I listen to your question, and I'm thinking about the root of entitlement. And for me, it goes all the way back to Genesis, to Adam and Eve, and the question that gets asked to them: did God really say? Yeah. And then the entitlement to eat the fruit comes as a result of that. And I think for me, the root of entitlement theologically starts in a mistrust that what God has given us is enough. That somehow what He's placed in our hands is not enough, and therefore there's a desire for more. And it's a mistrust followed by discontent, followed by a desire. So it's like mistrust, discontent, desire, and I think that's where the root of it comes from. And so I love what Jason's saying, because if we could just rest in the goodness of God, acknowledge the goodness of God, practice generosity as a consequence of how generous God has been to us, and build some of those practices of gratitude into our lives to constantly refute the lie which the enemy will consistently bring to us, is that you don't have enough, you're not enough, He hasn't given you enough, there's more.
Yeah. I think learning to be grateful. You know, Tuesday's message, please and thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do we every time, like God does something, go, God, thank you? Like, God, we just so thankful. God, we're just so blessed. God, it's just such an honor. Wow, I saw the income at the end of the month. God, thank you that you've entrusted us with this money. God, what do you want us to do with it? And I think if we're constantly in that zone of just being gracious and saying please and thank you for everything that we have, everything that's in ministry, and not comparing it to what we don't have, seeing other people and then feeling we're entitled, I think that some of that can guard us in our hearts.
But
and in our
it comes
spirits.
back to that deep-seated thing to say to God consistently, though I may not feel it, I trust theologically that what you have given me is good, sufficient, and for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it starts with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I add quickly, Sean, what you're saying about please and thank you? I think for every one of us, if you're leading in a church and people are following, like if they're serving in whatever capacity, I mean, I know people are serving God. I get that. But practically, they're following you. They are doing what you've asked them to do, and I think that that's a part of that gratitude and being great, like because if we don't, then we don't appreciate what people are doing, and then we feel entitled that people do what we're asking them to do and serve our vision and our strategy. I think genuinely fostering gratitude towards what people are doing constantly, I think, can also help feed that attitude.
Yeah. Awesome. Let's just hop onto that idea of contempt. You know, there was a disregard for God's offering, and it's a disregard for what God has placed in our care. It's almost as though it's like a flippant treating of what God has placed in our care. And so often God has placed his mission in our care. And we can so easily disregard that, because I think what sometimes starts to happen is that we can use ministry as a platform for other things. And that can be the danger. So ministry can be a platform for my vision, my goals, and I think there is a blending. I mean, God, you know, hopefully your vision is God's vision, your goals are God's goals, but at the same time, it always belongs to God. So it's the issue of ownership when it comes to contempt. Who owns it? Who owns it? Is it my vision or God's mission? Is it my goals or God's goals? Is it my staff or is it God's staff? Is it my church or is it God's church? And you know, sometimes when guys are getting ready to go into ministry and maybe senior pastorship, and I know like the phrase, like we mustn't get hung up on the phrase, but like the phrase can be, when am I getting my own church? Well, you never get your own church because you never own the church. So it's never your own church. It's always easier. I mean, I know why we say it, but it's so easy to kind of have that disregard for what God has put into our hands. So how do we guard against that?
Do either of you gents want to go? Contempt, particularly. Shawnee, do you want us to talk
The Bishop of
particularly
Boxburg
into
should answer
contempt?
that one.
Like
Just around
contempt.
that idea, yeah.
I think it's the distinguishing between sacred and secular. So what Eli's sons were doing that really was that the lines had blurred between the sacred and the secular for them. The sacred had become secular. And I think that happens again when there's a misplaced theology of self. The only reason they could do that, like, let's be honest, the only reason you could genuinely believe that you could get away with that is if you didn't have a fear of God in you.
Yeah, that's right.
That's ultimately the lie that bought into there. Same as Adam and Eve was, I will promise you something that's better than what God has for you. And so they bought into the lie that fear of God doesn't matter. And in other words, And listen, the lies of the culture are all, in essence, they're all wrapped up in the same thing. The same thing is, God is not enough, you need to become enough. That's the essence of the fall, isn't it? What He's given you isn't enough. Yes. So, Phineas and Hophni, the portion that's yours is not enough. You need more. And the only reason they could do that, the only way you can misplace the sacred and the secular, the only way you and I can let the sacred become secular is if the fear of God, and I don't mean that in the negative, but it's the holiness of God, the fear of God, the separateness, the called out. It's the same reason why you can abuse the church is if you stop believing that it's the called out ones, it's the ecclesia, it's the sacred. And I think a renewed understanding, a revival of the understanding of sacredness could contribute to some way to that. Yeah.
And again, I think even practically, I would ask the question, when's the last time I felt genuinely convicted about something?
Yeah.
When's the last time my conscience was pricked? When's the last time because I mean, guys, we're all wrestling our sinful nature and our flesh. And so I think one of the ways to maybe avoid, having a contempt for the things of God is to have a sensitive conscience. And I mean, we were talking about that the other day, and just like, God, please help us to resensitize our conscience, that we are sensitive to the pricks, and that it doesn't wait, that doesn't take an implosion for us to realize, like, oh, like God, and it's just that constant examining, it's that constant, I think, being sensitive to. Sorry.
Did you just say? Just want to acknowledge something, Jace.
What did I say?
Let's try and not be sensitive to the
Whoa,
pricks.
Okay. To the pure, all things are pure. I'm just saying, to the pure, all things are pure.
Sue just caught my eye.
I
Shorty, there's a
apologize.
question that came on the entitlement. May I read it quickly? Just because I know you want to move through the 4 things, but this is specifically on entitlement. What are some of the signs that could help us recognize that we're leading in an entitled spirit? And then how would that affect the people we work with? Do you see signs, like maybe just because you're the interviewer, it might be an opportunity to ask you a question. What are some of the signs of entitlement that you see? Or that you could say to somebody, this is a potential sign that you may have moved into that space?
There's so many signs. It's like, where do you start? I think the moment that you start seeing in people that they're acting as though they deserve this, and as though things are just normal, and I think we pick a lot of it up from American culture. I mean, let's just be real. Like, so much of our thinking is westernized, and there's a lot of good in that, but there can be a lot of trappings in that. And so entitlement really comes so often when people are getting around and we start to compare. And I think the minute we get into comparison and we start to see what other people have, we always think up. So we go, they got it, so surely I should get it.
Yeah.
We never think down. We never think they don't have it, maybe I shouldn't have. Isn't that true?
Yeah.
And so we start to think up, and there's nothing wrong. If I had to ask you, like who wants to live better? Who'd like more money? Who'd like a better salary? Who'd like a nicer car? Like I'm sure most of us would be like, listen, not a lot of people think down, but when I think that you begin to think that some of those things are just normal, or you miss the stories of maybe how somebody got there, how much they sacrificed to get to certain places.
Sure. Yeah.
And then we go, but they all have it, so I should have it,
Yeah.
I mean, think of a silly thing. Every pastor has an iPhone.
Or should.
Or should.
You're like, why would
Some are misguided and have Android, but
why would you do that?
Yeah. But I remember for years, like going around and particularly when the iPhone was like newer and came out, and in every Christian circle and discussion, it was like with pastors, like, you don't have an iPhone? No, you should definitely get an iPhone. You got to get an iPhone. But it was almost like if you're a pastor, if you don't have an iPhone, you know, then it's not like, yeah, like what's wrong? Come on. And then we justify. We go, no, but it's so handy and it will help you so much more and this and that. But you know what? An iPhone 13 costs 30,000 rand.
Hey.
So, and again, it's got nothing to do. I got an iPhone, thank you, God. But when we start to just think somehow, like we just deserve these little things, like it should be automatic and all of these things. And I think that can become dangerous, and the comparison trap that starts to happen like that.
Feeling like you deserve it. Trev, for you, like when you see it in young leaders, like
So for me, it's as clear as servanthood falling out of the window. I think it's one of the quickest things we can identify when we lose our willingness to serve. We find that we link is prevalent, because as soon as we think that we are to be served rather than to serve, we are in fact being contrary to the real reason Jesus came, right? Jesus came not to be served but to serve, and in the same space, I think it's the simplest sign to see, because servanthood is so easy to identify, which is, I think, critical. And when we start doing that, then entitlement follows. Well, because I am now the youth leader, they should be serving me. Or now that I am on full-time team, they should be serving me, or whatever it looks like. And I think one of the easy ways to combat that is to be a servant. So one of the things I love to do whenever I'm with Urban Edge, the regional meetings and stuff, the people who serve in the team, I do it partly because it's funny, but secondly because it freaks people out. And I'll take my own plate to the kitchen, and the team you shouldn't be doing that. But in real terms, go back to what I said earlier. I, Trevor Coleman, person, run the risk of being entitled. So I have to do and put barriers in my life that keep me from doing that. So it's not because I'm trying to be false humble. It's because if I don't do those things, I will fall in a trap. So it's not actually anything more than that. I've got to constantly have activities in my life. So servanthood is easy to see because it's a quick identifier. Any one of us who has to be served and feels that why isn't someone serving me? Well, now, I'm very different when I'm paying for a service. I expect it, but because I'm paying. If you're flying on an airline, you want that airline to be good, you expect good service, right? But when in the context of church context, we should be serving. We should be serving our congregation members. We should be helping them, doing whatever's necessary. And maybe ask a question. If a person in the church came to us as a pastor and said, listen, someone left skid marks in the toilets and it's quite gross, would we be willing to go, I'll go to the bathroom with a scrubbing brush quickly and go and resolve that problem? Yeah. And if the answer is, oh, no, there's someone on our team that could potentially do that, well, it's the beginning of the next phase of difficulty. So, and that's really just to me, it's servanthood. If we can serve and serve and serve, we can combat that problem.
These questions are coming through on an iPhone 13, by the way. Just Urban Edge's iPhone 13. I'm just.
True story. Was there another question related to that?
There's not related to that. Yeah.
Let's just quickly touch on just this idea of seduction, and you know, like sex is the obvious thing, and I think like you know, God, do all the things, blah blah blah. But I think one of the real dangers that we're definitely seeing more and more, and again in the church world, and again it's not everybody. I think the majority of ministers are humble servants. But there can be some dysfunction coming in. Is this whole area of power. And I think naturally as a leader, you just want to lead, you want to charge, you want to do things, and you don't want anybody to stop you. And when you get that feeling, it's like Vladimir Putin. Why is he invading Ukraine? Does he need more land? Does he need more money? He's apparently maybe the richest guy in the world on the planet. You know, does he need? No, it's just that sense of power. World leaders, like the hunger for power. So how do we subdue this thing? Because as leaders, naturally, you want to do more, reach out for more, gain more, and there's nothing wrong with that. But how do you stop it? This whole idea of like this power. I'm in charge. It's my thing. How do we guard against that?
It's like that quote that I read yesterday from the unknown was, you know, if you want to test a person's character, give them power. It's the ultimate test of character, actually, is what do you do when you have power within your grasp. Dr. Paul Alexander said something in lectures about a decade ago. I think Paul and I were in the same class, so you may remember this. He said, the root of every problem in the world is the spirit of empire. Or phrased differently, it's the insatiable desire for power. It is the root of every problem. And I think in my own life, stopping and acknowledging for a moment what power does when it's misplaced is quite sobering. So you see how, if you see how power is abused, what I'm saying is look at the results of it and then ask yourself, am I abusing power? It's quite a sobering reality because you see Russia invading Ukraine and you see the devastation. But now you can take that and you can pull that to like a microcosm of your own life. So if I power up on my kids, might not be a physical war like that, but there might be devastation in the wake of that. So for me, how I try and keep a grip on this is to look at what power does when it's misused. It's sobering. It's almost like, you know, the drinking and driving ads. You go like, don't drink and drive, and they show you a car wreck. It's almost like, look at the car wrecks around you of misplaced power, and then realize that it's rooted in the same issue. And sorry if I feel like I'm harping on this, but it all comes back to the same issue. The desire for power is a misplaced understanding of self, that what God has given us is not enough, therefore I must grab for more. I must have the power to know good and evil. It was power that was never intended for the human being, but I'm going after it anyway because I don't trust what God has given me. So it's like, look at the car wrecks around you and then ask yourself, do you genuinely believe that what God has placed in your hand, as it is, without reaching and grabbing for more, is sufficient? And if in His sovereignty He chooses to bless you with more, well, that's fine. But don't go grab it. Don't go look for it. Don't go reach for it. You know, it's for each of us to do the very best with the gifting God has given us and allow Him to bless. It's like somebody asked the question, how do you balance ambition and, let me just get the word here because it speaks directly to this issue, Shawnee. How do you balance the tension between ambition and contentment in ministry? I think it's to say to ourselves, have I gone to bed at night, looking myself in the mirror, knowing that I've stewarded what God has given me, the wisdom, the provision, the blessing, the ideas, the team, the people, the marriage, the family. Have I stewarded it in a God-honoring way? Have I done the very best with the talents I've been given, if it's 2 or 5 or 10? Because contentment, I think, comes from a deep-seated knowledge that I've done. Like what you were talking about earlier, I've done what I could have done.
That's good.
I've lived my life the very best way I knew how to. And I have to trust the windows of heaven to God. I cannot force open the windows of heaven. I can be honorable, I can be godly, I can lead my life in the very best way I know how, and leave the rest to Him.
I think one of the keys there, you know, and this is, I think even for me, this self-awareness, I think about a lot is stewardship or ownership, stewardship or ownership, stewardship or ownership, stewardship or ownership. And the minute I start to weigh into ownership, I have to pull back. God has simply called me to be a steward of what He's put in my hands. I cannot own it. I do not own it. I'm simply called to steward it. And what I love about that story of the talents is when they stewarded, God still brought increase. That's what I love. Good stewardship will bring increase.
That's right. Yes.
Will bring more.
Yes.
But it's still a stewardship thing. And when the increase comes, it's not yours. You don't make the profit and skim off the top. You know, you make the profit and then you steward all of that all over again. And if we really, really, really get the revelation of stewardship, then we will be content, and we will be effective because we're taking deep care of what it is that God has placed in our hands. That's why every person in our church matters. Every person in our church matters because God has called us to steward them. And we don't despise them. We don't treat them with disdain. We don't use them as our stepping stones to get further or to get more. We simply steward them. And if we do that, God will bring the increase in our lives. We have to get back to this idea of stewardship. I don't own it. God owns everything. And then you resist it. So let's just close off quickly talking about this is a big one, and accountability, power, ownership, all of these things, and good people fall because of these things. It's my ministry, it's my gift, it's my thing, it's this and that, and whenever there's resistance on that, then I'm going to kick back because it's not this idea of ownership. And you know, one of the things I was thinking about even coming into this, and that's why I mentioned it, was that we can look at big people in the world who've fallen and go, you see, they had a lack of accountability. But if we don't actively foster
Big time.
that, and now, and again, I think we are so isolated as ministers that we do not allow anybody a window into our soul. And it's the most unhealthy thing we can do, is this feeling that we have to do it alone, that we all, you know, when people in ministry go, ministry is lonely, I get that on one side, but on the other side, I don't get it, because you can choose to be unlonely. You know, you don't, accountability is given. I remember somebody saying that you don't ask for accountability, you give accountability. In other words, you don't go to somebody and say, hey, will you be my accountability partner? Because the guy's going to say sure, and then he's going to ask you a question. So did you sin? And guess what? If you don't want to be accountable, your answer is going to be? So you don't ask for it. You give accountability. You press in. That's how accountability works. You press in. It's not someone pressing it. You press in. And I sincerely don't think that as ministers we're pressing in enough. We don't have time. We don't have energy. Sometimes we don't know who. But if we don't do it, we're going to get into trouble. We're going to get into trouble. And we have to get back to that place where we've got some fathers, people who can speak in, and there can be accountability that we can give so that we can be healthy. And I think a big reason why so many souls are unhealthy in ministry is because they're not allowing that. We're not allowing that in our lives anymore. And it's very unhealthy because we'll get very lonely and very isolated. Thoughts?
Guys, I think a discipline of confession is one of the greatest keys to resolving everything we've spoken about. I think it's a muscle that has to be formed. I think it's painful at first. I think it's shocking at first. I think it is something that has to be developed, and you build trust over time. So the level of depth that I think you go to with that person, will vary over time. But I don't think we should wait until we're in trouble for us to actually confess. Why not? So it's kind of like going to a personal trainer every week instead of waiting until you have to go to the hospital, type of thing. And And I think God honors that kind of humility, but it's also like, don't wait until you have a whole bunch of shame that you have to share. You know, if we can form relationships where you're just addressing the stuff that you think God's inviting you towards, you know, like, hey, I really feel like God's encouraging me to be more mindful of private acts of service, for example. Or, hey man, yes, I really was struggling with powering up with my kids or staff or whatever earlier this week. Like those are the slightly more sanitized things to talk about. That make it a little bit easier when you have to say, hey, I think I'm drinking too much, or hey, I'm struggling with porn, or hey, I'm struggling with I think I'm starting to be tempted to blur lines with financial stuff. The things that we think are a little bit more hectic. I think if we haven't already started building up a stamina for real, vulnerable, accountable, and vulnerability is when I give someone something that they can hurt me with. Transparency is when I let you see what I want to let you see, but vulnerability is like, this is scary. Sure. I'm like risking, but I think we have to start somewhere. But yeah, guys, for me, confession has to be one of the most significant, humbling practices and disciplines that will help resolve a lot of the stuff, or at least to some extent combat some of the stuff that we're talking about, because it humbles you, it starves your ego. Oh,
Yeah.
terrifying and life-giving.
Yeah, Jace has sparked a thought. You know, I guess if we look at, let's bring this back to Jesus. We look at his life, we look at the immense pressure that his ministry was under, and he was under. I think part of the solution is to root ourselves in the practices of Jesus.
Yeah.
So if the goal is to be like Jesus, which it is, and if it is to build his church with him and co-labor with him on that, then surely his life should be the guiding kind of compass or the North Star for us, right? So as we seek to follow his life, as we seek to minister out of his life, let's follow his life itself. What did he do on earth? Yeah. So, principles of silence, principles of solitude, principles of prayer or disciplines of prayer, disciplines of community, disciplines of fasting. He didn't have to confess because he didn't sin, but he did tell people when he was feeling stretched and tempted. Yeah. Very much so, yeah. So I guess, and it might sound simple, but this is actually, like Jace was talking about, the muscles that need to be worked. This is actually deciding to live a life that looks like Christ's life. Backstage, behind the scenes, you know. And it's got very little to do with anything of the external leadership that we end up presenting to the world. It's actually all got to do with our own fasting, prayer, silence, solitude, scripture, confession. And that just forms us slowly, surely. Like it doesn't come quickly. It's hard, it's difficult, it's messy, it's 3 steps forward and 5 steps back. But at the end of the day, we model our lives on what his life looked like. Yeah. And slowly but surely we take on the likeness of Christ. And slowly but surely the financial things worry us more. And you know, the entitlement slowly starts to dissipate. You know what? Does that make sense? Thanks, Jace. Your conscience gets stoked.
Yeah.
So I think it's about coming back to a Christ-centric model of life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Please, can I add? Also, in some cases, lower the bar. Like it'd be great to have a spiritual father, but if you don't have that, start with a brother or a sister. Like, no, I mean, seriously, guys, I just think...
Find someone.
Like, freaking anybody, you know?
Yeah.
Okay, maybe not anybody. Okay. But, no, guys, listen. Okay, to be completely honest with you, I have had to wrestle over the question over the years because there is vulnerability. If you're going to confess stuff to someone, there's risk involved. As a pastor, there's risk involved. But I honestly feel like God has asked me, do you care more about... like, again, being a Christian, you know, and actually finishing well, or the risk of your confidence being broken. So what if this person shares something that you've shared? Or what if there's recourse? Okay, well, what's the real goal? What's the real burden? Surely it is to love Jesus and actually finish well and spend eternity with him. And I just think guys, I think again, courage is when the risk of not acting becomes greater than the risk of acting, and the risk of not living with some level, at least an entry level. Like if you've never done it before, start somewhere. Start where you are, not where you want to be. Just like if we're not willing to risk that, you have to know that you're risking your soul. You are risking your life, so you can build a church and lose your soul. And I think that there's a healthy fear of that, like a healthy reverence and humility of that needs to come in. But just start somewhere and start light. But guys, there shouldn't. I don't think any one of us, none of us, should be walking around without ever having the occasional, intentional, vulnerable conversation with at least one, preferably two people, where there's just that, I don't know, iron sharpening iron, and accountability and confession.
Great.
Byron, time is going, but a couple of rapid fire questions.
Do you want to do those?
You do it. You can ask him.
Happy to. If we don't get to your question, thank you for it. We'll get an answer to you afterwards. This one said, what are some key practices, individuals, couples, families, you've put in place to cultivate and maintain health and growth? Rapid fire. So I'm literally going to pick a person and go for it. Practices that have kept you healthy. Shawnee, we'll go with you for this one. Practices that have kept you healthy. Like what's a confession Jace has spoken about. What else?
Do you know, I think it's all the basics again. I think spending time with the Lord, spending time with your spouse. A few weeks ago, my wife, she'll do this from time to time. She's like, you need to hear me, not spending time with me. And I have to circle back. Spending time with your kids, creating a healthy base from which you can minister, I think is so essential for us as ministers. We can run off and gun off and save the world, but we're so unhealthy because our home is in such chaos. And I think we have to nurture and fight hard to create healthy balances. And start there, because I think it's so much more healthy. And then a couple of healthy friendships that we can just do life with and just have fun with. Like we need to have fun, people. You've got to have fun.
It's great. Thanks,
I'll live this world without fun.
This one, young leader. As a young leader, how do you work towards and seek what you feel you're called to? I'm going to ask you, Trev, to answer this one. What you're called to when you feel you're not progressing maybe, or the position that you're in at the moment doesn't adequately feel like it's preparing you. So you've got a calling, like you feel like you're a young leader. How do you work towards your calling when you're not currently released into it, or you're not currently on the track, it feels like?
The best way to step into the vision God has placed on your life is to serve another person's vision. So start there. If we believe that the outcome of our journey is in the hands of someone else, we are not serving the mighty God we serve.
That's right.
So in other words, if we genuinely believe that God is calling us towards something, then we need to trust the process through which God is calling us.
That's right.
So I'm going to say that again. If we trust that God is calling us to something, we need to trust the process through which God is calling us. And I think so often we're called to serve leaders in our world who may have something to deposit, something to invest, maybe some rough edges that need to be filed off, so that we can be the better version of ourselves. And I think someone asked, ambition. What's the difference between healthy ambition and contentment? Unhealthy ambition is when we start to try and pave the way for ourselves. Whereas in this particular case, it's best to do what we need to do and let God do what he needs to do. And in the right time, in the right place, in the right moment, at the right season, you'll be released into the right role.
Humble yourself under the mighty hand of God, and in due time he'll lift you up.
That's right.
Jace, how do we cultivate a fathering and mothering culture in the church? How could that begin to take root? As a leader, like what one thing would you do? Maybe let's start with what one thing would you do as a leader to start bringing the issue of mothering and fathering into the life of your church?
So grateful I got the easy question.
Yeah.
First of all, I think there has to be somehow we have to foster trust and safety, and I think
That's why I asked you, because it's a great answer. Seriously, that is good.
I think if people,
It's trust.
if people are afraid of us,
Yeah.
guys, I mean, come on, man, as leaders, oh, please, God help us. God help us if people are afraid of us or intimidated by us. We should be inspiring, not intimidating. And I think if we create a sense of safety, a sense of unconditional love, bring your crap, share the truth. Guys, I honestly think that, this is my personal conviction, I think that God is wanting to do something in the kingdom where a raw honesty is allowed, not to water stuff down or to, but just where integrity and trust is rebuilt, that we can be real about where we're at. And I think for parents, for kids to trust parents, there has to be a sense of, okay, I'm going to be loved through this, and I'm going to be loved well, and they're patient. Like they're going to walk. So I don't know. That sounds like a very philosophical answer, but I just think somehow trust and safety has to be nurtured. You know.
That's great. Thank you.
Can I make a comment on that? Just, I think we have to be so aware that we call to nurture people, and we all hate those parents who are the overachiever parents who are trying to live their dream through their children.
Yeah.
And so they're always wanting their children to achieve more, do better. Yeah. They're pushing them to be more successful, go harder. And we like, that is terrible. Like, why? Like what kind of a parent? And we freak out at that. But then we become those parents in the church.
Yeah.
Because we have great dreams and visions, and there's a fine line between constantly whipping and pushing our volunteers harder and harder and harder, and go further and go more. And then when they don't want to, and they say they quit, we never pay attention to them ever again.
That's right.
And we give off a very bad smell.
Yeah.
That really isn't a healthy
100%.
parenting thing.
100%. 100%.
We've got to love people no matter what, and we've got to gauge the line between pushing too hard and sometimes just pulling back a little bit.
Yeah.
Because if our kids, all they're thinking is the only way mom and dad are going to love me is if I achieve.
Big time. Big time.
Then there can be a danger.
Amen. I think let's close it.
Yeah.
There are some fantastic questions coming through. I just want to do justice to them, and I don't feel like I want to minimize the question by giving a quick answer. So what we'll do is we'll commit to answering those that have come through now. Thank you for them. We'll get you a voice note back answering as best as we can in the next week. Okay? Thanks, Ronnie. Great.
Awesome.